on Nova Legends podcast, I have Coach Mark Wysocki. Mark works for Stack Sports, a consulting group that consults in all aspects of youth sports, consults with teams, players, leagues. He's going to tell us more about Stack. Coach, good to see you. Thanks for doing this.
Yeah, thanks, Julian. Appreciate it.
Sure. Well, before we get to actually, is it Substack or Stack? It's Stack.
Stack Sports. Yep.
Stack Sports. Okay, make sure I say it right. Before we get to Stack, let me give your background. I believe you're from suburban Maryland. Is that correct, Coach?
Correct. Southern Maryland.
Southern Maryland. Okay. And you were a top soccer player as a youth. You went to American University. Played. You were a starter at American University. You've been coaching for many years, very high level. Coach girls, coach boys. Also coach futsal. Played futsal at a pro level as well. And you've always been in, I believe you're a sports management and math major. So you've always been involved in sports of some kind. Did I get the broad sketches right, Coach?
Yeah, no, that's, well, now looking back, it's a little crazy to kind of embrace it all, but that's relatively the picture.
It makes you sound older than you are.
Yeah, well, or maybe I am as old as I think I am. So
exactly. Well, why don't you tell us exactly what Stack does? When I went to the website, you have quite a lot of services. So my guess is you're a consulting group and software group that can do a little bit of everything. But why don't you tell us what exactly you guys do?
Yeah, so Stack Sports is a leader in the kind of sports technology space, and so ultimately we oversee a full ecosystem of sports tech products, software systems, what have you, and to kind of break it down even further. So one of our biggest systems is Sports Connect, which is a big kind of youth sports registration system. And then on top of that, we've built a lot of kind of supporting solutions that help, referee management, tournaments, other products itself that kind of enhance the experience. And so, yeah, ultimately the goal is to kind of increase participation and, kind of transform the youth sports experience in general. And so in my role, I focus a lot on our like strategic partnerships. And so ultimately working with some of the bigger national governing bodies, youth state soccer associations, to ultimately kind of consult on what they're currently doing, what they potentially could consider doing better, and then ultimately identifying if we have some solutions that could help.
Well, one thing I like about your company is that it sounds like you guys can pivot any way that's necessary. Depending upon the need, you guys can probably serve that need, or you have the brain power to find a way to serve that need. Is it getting to be a crowded space now? I know 20 years ago or so when you were playing, or at least starting to play, the sports consulting business and all the businesses around sports was much smaller than it is now. What does that space look like today?
Yeah, it's a good point. I think our organization is unique in that there's a lot of resources surrounding. So like the registration space isn't, I'll say, common, right? There's a lot of players in the space. Obviously, we've been around for, well before I started there, but maybe 20 plus years or so. So there's a lot of experience that we've been able to lean on to not only kind of perfect that like core registration solution, but to build upon, like, as you mentioned, all the other inputs around that to help make that experience more seamless. So again, I know I mentioned a few on the referee side, tournaments, video capabilities and what have you. And so, so being just a company that's been around the block for a bit, there's a lot of kind of historical knowledge that has played into kind of perfecting what we currently do, but then building on it and adding a lot of really bright people within the organization to think differently and ask difficult questions. And then, ultimately, if you put your tech and dev hat on, it's okay, well, can we add in some of that functionality or features? Can we build something? Or maybe it's acquiring a company that's doing a really good job. So yeah, maybe big picture is it is very a very polished organization that has a lot of experience that ultimately makes strategic decisions on direction. And so, but yeah, if there's a challenge in the sports space, pretty confident that we've had conversations about it one way or another.
Do you guys see yourself getting into the NIL space? Because you hear about this. I haven't heard about this in soccer as much. because the high school aspect of soccer is not as big or as especially for players at the highest level. It's not quite as important part of their soccer experience. But do you see you guys get into the NIL space as well?
Yeah, it's a good question. I do know that because ultimately our lens is very focused on the technology side. And so on the NIL side, there's a lot of like account management layers built in, and you can, I don't know all the rules top of head, but from an agent perspective and having somebody manage your quote unquote portfolio as a college athlete. That said, I do know that there are quite a few kind of technology platforms that have popped up to help college athletes manage that process and or connect brands to athletes. And so it's a good point. I need to do a little digging on conversations that we've had behind the scenes, but I'm sure it's not not on the radar, I guess is the way to put it.
Yeah. Well, in terms of rules, from what I see, there's not many rules yet. I'm sure one day it'll be a highly regulated space, but it seems like now I hate to use this phrase, but everyone else says it's the wild, wild west.
Yeah, no, and so, and I know there's like state by state regulations that have started to come into play, and when there aren't any rules, you certainly can maximize it, and then as regulation comes in, then obviously you've got to keep yourself buttoned up.
Yeah, the Virginia High School League, as you may know, has approved of NIL in high school sports, and
Right.
I've had outreach to I've had outreach to me about getting involved, and the idea of talking to high school about endorsement deals is just doesn't really appeal to me. But this is the world that we live in, a world that you weren't able to quite experience unless you were a football player from Texas who was able to get a suitcase of money under the table. But I don't think that describes you. Well, look, what about you're very lucky in that you have done different aspects related to sports. I mean, there's a lot of opportunity now with sports. There's before there was coaching and there was officiating, maybe a commissioner. There are certain things, but now there's consultants like yourself in the software and services providing service providers like Stack. There are one-on-one training. There are performance trainers. There are, I mentioned NILs. I've talked to a lot of college coaches now, and one thing I've noticed about them, they all stay in their jobs a very long time, which generally means that the opportunity is it's a good job.
Sure.
So when you look at the horizon, is it exciting that there's so many different opportunities in sports, and you've been able to take advantage of quite a few of them?
Yeah. No, it's a good question because I think as I was going through high school, college, and beyond, I obviously was very connected in the soccer space, but had a drive towards the sports business landscape, but didn't necessarily know what I wanted to do, right? And so it's a conversation with a lot of kind of rising athletes where, they've obviously played a sport for a long time. They love the sports space. They love being a fan of sports, but may not necessarily know what goes into, sports business options as they consider career paths. And so that was a piece that I learned over the time of like, okay, well, there's these many different inputs to the sports space, like what draws me in, what do I not like, and then ultimately, I can kind of navigate my career path to where I'm at now. But one piece I found early on was like, is exactly that, trying to separate the fandom in sports with the actual technical acumen to be successful in the sports space. And one piece that I know a lot of like rising, college students and maybe young business professionals maybe didn't realize, although it's very obvious, is that oftentimes sports events don't happen in your 9 to 5 hours, right? Oftentimes in the evening or the weekends. And so, if you're going into the sports space initially, you may find yourself in a role that's going to require hours beyond your norm. And so, reflect some of the days I worked at DC United, and, I was there on game days, and that was in the evenings or on the weekends. And the list kind of goes on, the coaching space, obviously, no one's coaching between 9 and 5 unless it's a day off from school or whatever it is. So ultimately, I took the lens of like, by all means, want to contribute to some of those inputs in those hours. However, now I've got a 1.5-year-old. And so those hours have had to be adjusted to be a coach of one running around the house. and then ultimately, obviously, finding myself at Stack Sports, where it very much so is kind of a 9 to 5 role, although obviously we're helping clients and partners in different hours of the week. But many kind of variables as you're kind of evaluating like where you could provide value in the sports business space, and then ultimately kind of what your day-to-day work-life balance kind of looks like. And so, yeah, a piece of the puzzle worth kind of diving into if you're looking into the sports space.
Yeah. Well, is it hard to leave, I guess, as they say, living the dream? One thing American soccer coaches can do is make a living coaching. It's very hard to do that in Europe. Like I think in
Sure.
Holland, I think 6% of the population are UEFA licensed coaches. So there's free, brilliant coaches everywhere, and very few are able to make a good enough living doing it. In America, it's not the case. Of the last 20, 30 years, soccer coaches can make a decent living. Oftentimes they have to supplement with one-on-one training and other things that they do, but they're able to make a living. Is it
Yeah.
hard? Is it hard to live that life? And what is the life of a full-time coach?
Yeah, it's a good question. I know, I mean, maybe it's kind of building off my last note, right? Where there's a lot of hours that go into it, right? And so, I think it kind of depends a little bit on what level you're speaking to, right? So obviously the professional level, very different from the college level, very different from maybe the youth academy route. And so, I mean, yeah, youth academy route, right? Like all the coaching takes place 5 to 9 p.m. or on the weekends, Saturday and Sundays. In my role at Alexandria Soccer, I spent a lot of my 9 to 5, focusing on the business itself, resource management, working with stakeholders across the city to help support, while at the same time helping to plan towards whatever teams I may have been coaching at the moment.
Which is the best of both worlds, because you're able to coach soccer and get some job benefits, which I think some coaches who do it full time struggle with.
Yep. No, and that's actually what I recommend for a lot of people who are considering the coaching space, to try to find themselves in a role where there are administrative responsibilities, just to broaden your resume for whatever may come down the road, and so that maybe you weren't only focused on the administrative side or only focused on the coaching side. You do bring a kind of a plethora of background to be able to contribute to different spaces. But yeah, and then mapping up towards like the college space, right? Where obviously you're, as a collegiate coach, you're answering to an athletic director. And so you're obviously setting goals and targets throughout the year that aren't just on the field, although winning solves a lot of problems
Yeah.
in that space. But ultimately, you're managing a program, setting a precedent and setting a culture. And so there's a lot that goes into that piece that maybe is a little bit different than kind of the youth academy side. And then obviously, mapping up to professional sports, it's a business in itself. And so, that's not a 9 to 5. That's a 24/7 job, especially when you're in season, and maybe more importantly, when you're not in season, to help prepare for the next. And so, definitely some kind of differences there, but all the same, I think those pieces of kind of looking to build a culture of excellence, mapping towards what is your goals, targets, success metrics for that given year. And then, I spend a lot of time kind of focusing on building relationships with the players and families, knowing that, if they trust you and you have their back, then it's going to result in good results, regardless of what is actually happening on the field.
Well, I think you made it, from my point of view, a great decision, because I'm in sales and I enjoy working for companies that are trying to grow. Did part of you, were you worried that you were leaving a career as a coach behind? Now, it's not that you can't coach, and I'm sure you can coach great Skylines in Charlottesville, a great club team, and I'm sure there's others in the area. I'm sure you can do one-on-one trainings if you want to. But did you feel like you were taking yourself out of being, maybe a coach at Georgetown one day, or a big time coaching job?
Yeah, I felt like I tried to keep that balance between those two hats of being a really strong kind of sports business administrator, along with kind of maximizing the coaching side, and working with kind of our teams as we're picking out who is leading what age groups or programs, to really challenge myself as a coach. So oftentimes I found myself coaching the older high school girls age groups, along with, and you may be familiar with the men's and women's, the futsal sides at Alexandria. And so Obviously very challenging and rewarding groups to work with that, push myself as a coach to, obviously stay on my toes, but, be sure that you're kind of preparing and executing at a high level, while at the same time, spending most of my day, behind the computer or on the phone, working with stakeholders and making sure that you're kind of prioritizing that side. And so, maybe a roundabout answer to your actual question in that, yeah, I don't know if I really had the end goal to be a collegiate coach. Certainly not off the table, and could find myself in that route. But as you noted, a lot of times, you have to be fortunate to find yourself in that role, on top of doing all of your due diligence, the coaching license route and what have you. But people often stay in those roles for a long time, so they don't become available,
It's true.
every year. And so, I think maybe my coaching route will evolve over maybe the next 4 or 5 years as my daughter starts to, get on the field, and no doubt I'll be, holding her hand / coaching, those teams, and may find myself back in that hat. But no, in a good spot at the moment. So, an interesting kind of pathway.
Yeah, well, you do a great job as a coach. I always like watching your teams play. So, do we do enough to support the coaches? Are they making enough money? Are they making too much money? I would argue that they don't. I like the coaches I built relationships with. Alexander, like Coach Maestro is a good friend of mine, and Coach Josh. I had so many good coaches. Coach Scott Sinker, I didn't get to know him as well, but Coach Keff from Joga. Coach Tommy Park's good friend. I enjoyed building those relationships. So I wish them every success in the world. But are we doing enough for coaches here? Or are they getting what they need? Not just to make the athletes better, but also in their own personal lives.
Yeah, it's a tough question. I think in obviously the US, you get into the whole pay to play conversation, and that maps towards budgeting, and, coaches could be paid well, or depending on how you're budgeting, maybe not. Oftentimes I feel like the quality of coach, maybe starting there, stems from, initial like touch points into the coaching space, and then ultimately kind of how they find themselves going across that kind of pathway, right? So more often than not, right, somebody who's entering the coaching space probably played soccer at some level. Some maybe not, and you don't necessarily need to be a player to be a good coach. And maybe that's where I'm going with this, is sometimes there's a lot of really good players who aren't necessarily great coaches.
Yeah.
But that said, oftentimes they come into that role with some type of background as a player, and they have their kind of preconceived notions of what a team may need to be successful, both based on how they've played in the past, what, tactics, activities they've done, and then ultimately mapping towards, maybe kind of where your question has stemmed from is, okay, like I'm a coach, I'm on the field, I'm managing this, and this, I'm running sessions, coaching games. But how am I actually kind of managing, quote unquote, my personal life, so that it's a kind of full picture of kind of, from the finances standpoint to the hours in the day to, family and spending time with them. Right. And so, it's a really tough question in terms of like being able to manage that balance, because I've come across a lot of coaches who put the hours in, and they do a great job, great coaches. But at times, it's the seasonality of the sport can be important for coaches, because they need a break and they need time to kind of reflect and, for lack of a better way to put it, kick their feet up for a week or a weekend or whatever it is. But obviously you notice at the highest levels, in youth sports, I mean, there's less and less of time off. And so that can certainly be a strain on coaches. But that balance is really important. And I think, finding an organization that you coach with that can help manage that becomes more and more important, especially, with some of those lenses in mind. The only other note I'll say is just like from like the value side and making sure that coaches are compensated. I think it's kind of a case by case basis, right? Where depends how much time you're putting in. It depends maybe what quality of coach you are, what level you're coaching at. More often than not, in the scenarios that I've kind of come across, is that coaches are relatively being, compensated fairly. But again, I do think it's kind of case by case, and you know, if you want to make a living out of it and year over year feel good financially, then you got to put a lot of time in on the field and or preparing for the field. If not, then you really need to find yourself kind of what I was referencing earlier, is that like administrative role that's combined with a coaching role, because then otherwise, the finances become tough. So
Well, I enjoyed watching your futsal team play, and I remember Kate was such a great player. Can't think of her last name, and you had such a great chemistry with those girls, and they would beat women. And then you coach the pro team, that the futsal pro team as well. What do you enjoy coaching women, girls and women? Do you find it a different skill set? Like some coaches can do it more easily than others?
it's interesting. I don't think I necessarily have had a preference. When I joined, so I coached for a club in DC for quite a few years, with some buddies actually from American, the Player Progression Academy. And then from there, coached at Alexandria Soccer. And so a roundabout way to get to your question is that basically when I joined Alexandria Soccer, I joined in like November of 2016 or something like that, which was the start of futsal season, and very fortunately fell into that 2002 girls futsal team. Fast forward 3 or 4 years from then, and they had a full career on the futsal side and the outdoor side. But on the futsal side, I mean, just a very talented, hardworking team that saw a lot of results. Like you said, gave the women's team a run for their money oftentimes, and so I kind of fell into that route, I guess is the way to put it, versus like choosing my path, men versus women, girls versus boys, what have you. No doubt there's definitely nuances between maybe coaching the girls and women's route that are different than the boys and men route. One that comes to mind, at least from the women and the men, is that the women will actually respond to availability and what's going on, and the men take a little time to get to wherever they're going. But no, I mean, thoroughly enjoyed kind of both sides. But yeah, just kind of naturally fell into kind of that high school girls age group, and then saw a lot of success with that 02 girls age group, and then also had the 06 girls for a while as well. And so just fell into some talent, kind of got lucky.
Yeah. Well, how about coaching youth versus coaching older teenagers, or even the pro team? I'm sure it's incredibly different. I
Yeah.
coach basketball. When you coach kids, you have to break down things like layups and stuff. And as they get older, you're mentoring more. You're doing the sports psychology part of coaching. But what about you? How would you compare kind of coaching different age groups?
Yeah, well, I mean, one, and maybe this is obvious, is that obviously the expectations are just higher, right? And so when you attach a label of pro or semi-pro or whatever it is, that professionalism, is needed. And so certainly many scenarios where, we're working with players that needed to better reflect those values and aiming to help guide them in that route. Less emphasis on maybe the like technical side, because is what it is, but by the time you're 25 or 30 you can always improve. But that technical side, I would hope, is already there if you're in that player pool, and now you can really focus on the tactical and strategic side. And so that was where a lot of my focus was with the women and the men's side, is really kind of honing in on like, what are we actually doing, what is our kind of DNA when we're on the court, and then helping guide that route. One piece that was very interesting is that futsal has been in the States for a long time, but certain pockets maybe haven't experienced it at a high level as much as you think. And so ultimately in these player pools, quite a few players that were extremely talented soccer players outdoor, but needed to kind of hone in their skill set, hone in the cadence of futsal a bit, to ultimately become very cohesive and talented futsal players. And so naturally, I think that's kind of how things work in the States regardless, right? The annual calendar is, soccer, fall, spring, summer, futsal in the winter. And so you have to kind of turn off the soccer hat, recalibrate to the futsal hat, and so on. And so, but yeah, a lot of kind of, tactical and strategic kind of building. You make a good point on the psychological side, right? Where, very different as you're approaching maybe some of these youth players versus adults. And sometimes the adults are taking more of your time from the psychological side. Maybe you have to have a look at yourself in the mirror for your own psychological.
Yeah.
But I'd say a bigger focus on the adults on kind of like trying to think of the right way to put it. So like on the youth side, I'd say oftentimes it's more kind of like building confidence and kind of building that mentality that like you are a very talented player, you are a very talented team, and on any day you can beat anyone that you're playing against. Versus on the adult side, I think a lot of talented players that came into the picture and they probably got that. And so more so focusing like on the moments, because in futsal it's extremely fast paced, right? And so every moment counts. The details are what matter, and it's very small margins that result in who's winning what. So a slight kind of difference in mindset, but yeah, interesting.
The moment I realized futsal was much different than soccer, it's not just indoor soccer, is when we were at nationals one time and your team was playing the Quebec women and we were playing the Quebec guys, and they played the game totally different. And the way they played it, some of these guys, I don't even think they were soccer players, but they were very good at it. Sure. And I realized it was a very different sport. Yeah. Is coaching futsal, like coaching soccer is incredibly complicated. People don't, I'm not a soccer guy. I only learned soccer because my son Chandler plays, and I've watched many games, and I read a little bit about it. But if you never played the game, it is difficult to understand things that go on. Because I'd ask Chandler about certain plays he made after the game, and he would explain them to me. There were things I didn't even see. But if you know the game, it's a very complicated game to play. Yep. Even more complicated to figure out where each player belongs. Even though he may belong at left wing, but on this team, we don't have the speed to play that way, so we might play. Soccer is a very complicated game. Is futsal complicated also to coach? I mean, if you're a good soccer coach, are you a good futsal coach?
Not necessarily. On the futsal side, I would say though there is a very specific kind of cadence and balance to the game, and every individual player's movement should impact their teammates and how they adjust their positioning, movement, what have you.
Like basketball.
Very similar. And honestly, like a very good exercise maybe to watch some basketball and hockey a bit to help inform, some of the movement, pieces of the puzzle. The only other piece I'll say is that kind of echoing like the moments in futsal, right? Where, maybe in soccer you can get away with, it's 11v11, right? So if one player takes a break, not saying this is okay, but more often than not, your team might get away with it if other people are helping pick up your slack or whatever. In futsal though, it's 4v4, 4+ a keeper. So if one person takes a break and you're 4v3, there's a good chance that team is going to get a scoring opportunity, which could result in a goal. And those games, oftentimes are 1-goal games in a high energy environment, what have you. And so all that to be said, I think the moments in futsal maybe are a little bit more important versus in soccer, where there's a little bit of kind of give and take.
Yeah. Well, my son Chandler, after he turned like 16 or 17, he didn't want to play futsal anymore, because when he played midfielder, he's a 6. He was constantly checking his shoulders and trying to figure out where everybody was, because he liked to play a one-touch game, so he always wanted to know where everybody was. He felt like futsal kind of would hurt doing that. He did not want to take 6 weeks of playing futsal, because he feels like you don't do a lot of that. I think the movement is different, and you can usually see all your teammates at all times.
Sure.
Do you feel as a player, obviously the futsal is good for your ball skills, but do you think playing lots and lots of futsal is always good for your soccer, or is there a balance?
Well, I'm biased. um, Personally, I think my emphasis on being a futsal player and coach has made me a significantly better outdoor soccer player.
Mm.
And maybe it's some of the layers of the game that you wouldn't necessarily think of. Like over the years, the more I played futsal, the more confident I felt in outdoor, literally just taking players on 1v1. Because in futsal, you're forced to play in 1v1 scenarios every single play. And so you ultimately become more confident. That said, it's a different game, smaller court, different rules. So no doubt that while layers translate to outdoor, you can certainly improve on some players or pieces of the puzzle for outdoor. You still need to play outdoor to be a good outdoor player and train in that mindset as well. And so ultimately, I do think that like the current annual calendar in the States where, futsal is traditionally kind of a November through March timeframe is probably a good kind of amount of time if your end goal is to be a soccer player where you're at least getting some different experiences that help progress you as a soccer player. That said, I'd say it's almost maybe more detrimental on the flip, right? Where if your end goal is to be a very high level futsal player, there's certainly layers within soccer that that maybe take away from you as a futsal player over time. One of that just being exactly that is the calendar, right? Where if you're playing soccer for 9 months of the year and only futsal for 3 months of the year, naturally you're going to be rusty or whatever it is. A lot of other variables that play into that, but yeah, personally, I've found that futsal has made me a better player over the years. Probably even made me a better coach too, because in futsal you kind of have to be in, every moment.
Mhm.
But definitely, the nuances that come with it along the way, and you gotta kind of wear whatever hat you're wearing at the moment.
One of the reasons why Alexandria Soccer's has had a meteoric rise to being a top level club. It wasn't like that when my son first started playing soccer in 2010.
Sure.
And do you think futsal had anything to do with that? It was one of the first clubs locally to really embrace futsal, but also keep it separate so that futsal almost kind of stood by itself in some ways.
Yeah, football definitely played a part, but I think maybe it's more so the broader mindset where Alexandria. So Tommy and team, we always had a mindset, and they still do, in that like looking to be like have that growth mindset as a business. So looking to offer more and more programming, looking to expand different levels of competition. So obviously more recently they've added in kind of MLS Next teams and the Girls Academy teams, which maybe is an expansion of, they were, one of the first organizations in the DMV area to really prioritize futsal and build that program up, maybe initially just to test the waters out, but now it's a pretty big engine. And I just got back from Northeast Regionals in New Jersey.
That's a great event.
Awesome event. But Alexandria had brought, I don't even know the number, but I want to say maybe 30 teams, right? And so futsal has definitely played a part in maybe the growth of talent and their programming in general. But I do think ultimately there's a high level of focus on increasing participation, growth in programming, growth in competition levels, both at maybe the recreational side, so making sure everybody has access, but also at the highest level of, well, are we competing at the highest level as possible, kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, let's go back to where you started playing soccer. You mentioned suburban Maryland. Where in Maryland, and when did you start playing soccer?
Yeah, so I grew up in Charles County, Waldorf, Maryland. And so no, I started pretty young at 3, 4, 5 or so. Made my kind of path through the youth soccer ranks, but ultimately, most of my days played with the Maryland ODP program, which is ODP program in general is kind of evolved these days. But also played with the Baltimore Bays program in Baltimore. Yeah, a couple state championships. It's funny, obviously, the Nova lens here, where when I went to American, had a lot of arch enemies from my club soccer days that were playing for Arreston or whatever it was. And then obviously, fast forward, and I was living in Arlington, Alexandria, coaching for Alexandria. So, but yeah, that was kind of my initial path. One other note though is that there was a very robust kind of futsal culture in Southern Maryland as
It
well.
still is, yeah.
And so which kind of was my like introduction to futsal. So I played with the organization called Sporting Maryland
Yeah.
for a long time. And so, but yeah, kind of that Maryland ODP route, Baltimore based, played for another team in Bowie, Maryland when I was younger. And then during my college years at American, played for like some of the DC United kind of under 20s, under 23 teams. Um, and yeah, post American still played for a lot of like um, men's leagues, but with the lens of like a lot of like ex college guys, but really kind of focused on like the semi pro futsal route, and trying to keep the dream alive there. Yeah.
Well, describe the development or development in Charles County, a slightly less affluent area than Northern Virginia. How different is it? I mean, obviously, one thing about soccer, it's considered in America a wealthy sport. It's not considered that in many countries, but obviously, the training, the fields, the facilities, the coaching it tends to go to the more wealthy areas. Is the development different in a Charles County? And has that changed over time? My guess is the gap, if there was a gap, has narrowed.
Yes. I'll say during my time, and maybe it was kind of reflected in my initial answers, right, where I was playing for a team in Bowie, Maryland, and Baltimore, and the Maryland ODP team, we trained at the Naval Academy, right? So, while certainly when I was younger, I'm sure I was in programs nearby, but at that more competitive level, oftentimes, and credit to my parents, but found myself traveling, whether it was 30 minutes to an hour, to train, 2, 3 times a week, and games on the weekends and what have you. That said, in Waldorf, Charles County, they've certainly invested in some of their facilities. So there's a really nice kind of indoor facility that has prioritized futsal. They also have a huge kind of ice skating rink as well. And so oftentimes, I think facilities start to play into that kind of emphasis of programming, because ultimately, if you don't have the fields or indoor courts to support the program, then obviously you're not going to be able to have those programs there. So all that to be said, over the years, I think they have the facilities there now, and I'd say now in Southern Maryland, and La Plata's maybe in that picture as well, there's probably 4 like youth soccer organizations that I could speak to off the top of my tongue, that are competing, and they're competing at a high level, whether it's the EDPs and some of the other initial leagues. They got players that are traveling, what have you. So certainly some growth. Different time when I was there, but I think over the years, facilities are there. Some smart people are in charge of some of those organizations as well now. Not that there weren't smart people before, but definitely with an emphasis on kind of the growth of the game and doing things the right way, kind of thing.
The opportunity at that area also, because the ethnic diversity, they're more diverse than Northern Virginia tends to be, and more African American kids are playing soccer now. I love Chandler played briefly with the Future Monarchs, a PG County team. Just They had some phenomenal players, and I'd love seeing a different expression of soccer from different types of players. Do you see that great potential in the diversity of where you're from?
I do. Definitely like a diverse population in general, and I think on the youth side, everyone was trying to find their like if they were going to prioritize sports, they were trying to find what sport spoke to them most and compete wherever they could. And so on the soccer side, certainly, right, there's a lot of good athletes. So Southern Maryland really well known for football and basketball teams. So I went to Westlake High School. While I was there, I mean, Westlake was putting up some numbers. Lackey High School, another very good football school over the years. Really, you can almost name any school in that kind of Southern Maryland Athletic Conference that has been a pretty good powerhouse, whether it's football or basketball. And so, kind of the age-old tale, right, in the United States in general, right? If certain athletes were playing different sports, how good could that sports national team be? Whether it's soccer players in a football or a basketball jersey or vice versa. And so, but yeah, I think, and maybe that's again is kind of maps back to the facilities and the access side, right? Where from a basketball court and a football field, maybe a little bit easier to access families to, get their kids there versus the soccer side, where in Southern Maryland for a long time, figuring out those facilities and access was a challenge. Whereas now, it's in theory been figured out.
Yeah. Well, we talked about Tommy Park in Alexandria. He's built a great program. But Alexandria is one of the wealthiest cities in the country. Could he have done that in Waldorf?
It's a good question. So, so Tommy, I think, started at Alexandria. Maybe don't want to age him, but maybe 10 years ago or so. And so, I do know when he initially, fell into that role, he had a good chunk of maybe programming and kind of supporting layers to work with, but definitely kind of put his head down and grind it out to get it to where it's at now. And obviously brought in some smart people that were working with us on the executive team and the team in general. And so and maybe echoing the facility side, right? Like that when I was at Alexandria, like Tommy and I were working very hard on a lot of facilities initiatives to expand capacity so that you can then focus on programming and expand participation. I know recently, I think the city passed adding, lights to quite a few fields in Alexandria. So, I think it was maybe 4 to 6 fields now that will have lights. So, from that 4 to 10 p.m. timeframe when, daylight savings is around, that's 6 hours a night times 7 times 52 weeks, that adds up. And so yes, I think maybe Waldorf Southern Maryland isn't quite there at that, level, and definitely not the same, level of fluency, but certainly some good kind of best practices and takeaways where as you evaluate demand, certainly need to focus on capacity and facilities and many other inputs to support that. Otherwise, maybe there's gaps.
Did you play high school soccer?
I did. So I played at Westlake High School. Great soccer team. Had some talented players that I played with along the way that I still play with. Ryan Russell, a good buddy of mine. He was a senior when I was a freshman. He played for Reston, but that's who I was playing with in Atlantic City. So we both played together in Sporting Maryland way back when, reconnected, and he leads a futsal program in Southern Maryland called Intensity Futsal. And so, but yeah, so did play high school, and I think maybe this is where you're going, is the debate between playing high school when you're a top level club player. And so, back then it didn't matter. Wasn't really a question. If you wanted to play club and high school, go for it. Now, obviously, a debate. And so, would you like my opinion on high school versus?
Well, let me frame it first. So obviously we talked about MLS Next, and there's in other leagues. I think in some degree the ECNL, if it's not a rule, there's pressure. Sure. And historically, there's been a lot of great players that didn't play high school soccer, not just recently. This has always been a debate, and a lot of times it matters how good your teammates are at the particular school that you go to, whether the coach is a real soccer coach, whether it's important at your school. All those things always have entered in. But so when Chandler was going through this, he was in Joga and other programs that kind of they kind of thought high school soccer was more like kickball, somewhere kind of beneath soccer. So when he first tried out for the soccer team, it was a COVID year. They didn't finish, but he got a taste of it, and they came back. And high school soccer was the most intense and exciting sports things he's ever gone through. I mean, State Cup is very similar for club, but high school's even beyond that, because his team was really good. They got to the state final, and you got crowds. People around school know you're an athlete, whereas you play club soccer, nobody knows. So it meant so much to him, and so it's a tough situation. And then, like, I know at our high school, Yorktown, this year, some of our best club players are coming back because they've already signed. So they had to sit out. Last year, if we had 1 or 2 of these guys, we would have went right back in the state finals, but they didn't play. But now they're back on the field because they've already signed. So so I understand these kids have to think about their future in soccer and all these things. But anyway, what is your what are your thoughts on high school soccer and whether top level players should compete?
So, well, I think you bring up maybe initially some of the good variables, right? Of like the level of emphasis at a given school, and whether or not you're going to be in a good environment to succeed. There's that. Ultimately, I am for it, with the caveat that I think it ultimately just depends on kind of like a load management conversation, where for me it was great because in Maryland we played high school soccer in the fall, and then we would play spring club soccer, and maybe there'd be a couple kind of like club events in the fall that deconflicted with the high school schedule. It was fine. In Virginia, although, right, the public school season is in the spring, the fall is the private school season. So there's kind of that competing dynamic. And then ultimately club just plays year round. So there isn't necessarily like a delineation between, spring versus fall and the load management, component. So when I was coaching some of the high school girls teams, it was a real challenge, right? Because, their high school practice is every day of the week. And then and they're coming from high school practice to a club soccer practice where they've just practiced for an hour and a half, 2 hours, and you're trying to get something beneficial out of your training session. So that's, I think, where the challenge really comes in. And then obviously you can get into some of the injury conversations. I'm more concerned on injury conversations as it relates to load management, which maybe is a reflection of just injuries in general versus like, I think a lot of times people maybe focus more on like the quality of play results in it being more physical, which then results in more injuries, which, certainly happens. But at the same time, I think, injuries happen at the highest levels and they're so I'd rather focus on the load management side, I think. That said, if load management like wasn't in the conversation, I think there's a ton of value in the high school side. One, just like added hours to play the game, and maybe you're focusing on different parts of your game on the high school side, whether it's you being a leader of your high school team, or you being able to be in situations where you can take players on more, or maybe be a little bit more selfish from time to time, or maybe be more unselfish from time to time. You're working on distribution or whatever it is. So I think that there's definitely value in it. That said, on the competitive club side, you certainly have to deconflict your own schedule to make sure that like you can breathe and like show up to things and be excited to play and have fun. But ultimately, that load management side is important. Yeah. I will say though, it's just the volume of hours adds up, and maybe this is a separate conversation. I was helping a lot of those O2 girls and others with some of their college prospects and pathways, and not necessarily just them, but even others on the boys side that would, give a shout on kind of, well, what can I do to be a college prospect? I'm interested here. And while like the environments that you're in certainly help, the coaches that you have that are championing you to what have you, but ultimately it kind of comes down to you and you looking yourself in the mirror a little bit, and are you going to put the work in? Are you going to set yourself goals, targets on the administrative side of like being recruited? Are you going to like do the outreach and go to a camp or whatever it is? I think a good example is I think her Ellie Goodrich at ASA, where
it's a great kid, great player.
Yeah, it's a really interesting story too. I think, while I was there at Alexandria, I could drive around Alexandria on a given weekend, and if she didn't have a game, she was on a field somewhere training or doing something, coaching, whatever it was. And so when I forget the like age old tale, it's like, 10,000 hours in a given sport and you can call yourself an export.
Oh, that's right.
I mean, yeah. The girls probably got
outliers.
Yeah, right. But I mean, Ellie's probably got, well over 10, 100,000 hours on the field. And so, and ultimately she found herself in a great scenario. She's, grown over the years. She's actually in South America right now playing in a women's futsal competition.
It's awesome.
So, but anyways, I know I kind of digressed there on the college route, but
she's a great person. So it's always worth talking about Ellie. So
yeah. So, but yeah, so that's, yeah.
So Mark, we talked about your high school career, but what about college? I know you played at American University. They have a great soccer tradition as well. Tell us about your experience there and your coach.
Yeah, so as I was going through my recruiting process, had a lot of great conversations with schools, kind of across the East Coast, maybe a couple outliers in there. But yeah, ultimately chose American. One, because of that, they had a really good history of success. I knew a couple players already at the school, and then a couple players that I was close with, that we were all kind of making our college commitment decisions, and we were having texting behind the scenes, and felt like it was going to be a really good kind of incoming class as well. Other part that was really nice is Americans in DC, right? So, from that like internship and job prospect planning piece, that was, pretty appetizing. And really the last piece is that it was kind of like close enough, but far enough from home, where it was maybe 45 minutes an hour. So, if I needed to pop home or if my parents wanted to come up to a game, they could. Or if I didn't want them to, or if I didn't want to go home, I didn't have to. Um, but yeah, so that was kind of my initial process. Our coach was Todd West, so he currently I think still coaches some of the youth programs here in the DMV. But yeah, so he led a lot of ODP programs over the years. The assistant coaches at the time were Jeff Kinney and Steve Totten. So Jeff Kinney is actually coaching at UAB now. I think he went to Tech and then made his way to UAB, and then Steve Totten actually went to Princeton for a long time. Not sure if he's still there or not. But yeah, it was a really good experience. And then obviously, when you enter a collegiate program, you in theory have been gifted 30 friends off the bat as you pop into college. And in my scenario, obviously all very good soccer players. And so, coming in with a like-minded kind of goal and maybe obsession to an extent. But we had a great team. That freshman year, I remember pretty much myself and our whole freshman class were like in the starting lineup regularly, setting a good kind of tone for our class, for better or worse. But ultimately, throughout my career, we did really well and made it to the Patriot League final essentially every year and lost in the final every year.
Oh, gosh.
And so the Patriot League being one of those conferences that got to win the tournament to make it to the tournament. But a great experience. And also one piece that was kind of appetizing initially is that our out of conference schedule was also very competitive. So we played a lot of ACC teams along the way. So, your Maryland's, I think we were down here at Virginia twice during my career. The list goes on. We went to Duke and did some of those tournaments. The list goes on a bit. But yeah, a great experience. And to be honest, still close to a lot of those guys today. I mentioned earlier, I worked with quite a few in DC at that one academy. So Mike Warden, so he actually played with me at Baltimore Bays way back when.
Wow.
And then we kind of went our separate ways. Initially, I worked in kind of the sports business agency route for 5-6 years. And I think he bounced around a little bit and ultimately started the Player Progression Academy. And it's still an engine kind of running now. But yeah, still close to a lot of those American guys, to date. Obviously, everybody's, married now, has kids here and there. So we're all still competing, I guess, but now vicariously through our kids. So
exactly. And you were an 8, more of an 8, like a attacking midfielder.
So interesting story. So actually, throughout high school, I was kind of a 6 / a 4-5 center back.
Wow.
As I went,
you don't seem big enough. You don't seem big enough to be center back.
Easy there. All right. No, so when I went into college, I started my freshman year at right back / center back.
Wow.
But throughout AU, I almost played every single role. So I eventually moved back into that 6 / 8 role. Had some short stints at the 9, from kind of a withdrawn 9, I guess is the way to put it. But yeah, kind of made my way around the field a bit.
Yeah, I only know you as an attacking player because I've only seen you play futsal. So you're always on the attack. So thinking of you as a center back, it's interesting. But futsal is different. People change the roles in futsal. Chandler plays a lot of back. He plays in the back in futsal where he's almost, he's a 6 and outside. Um,
Well, but it's funny you mentioned that because after playing futsal for so long, I ultimately have gravitated more and more to an 8-10 role.
mm,
And so, maybe that translation of a little bit of kind of attacking mindset, flair, what have you, has kind of pointed me in that direction.
yeah, that's how I think of you as a player. I think of you as I can see you as an eight because of your futsal games that
Yeah,
I've watched.
yeah.
So how would you compare not the rules or anything, but the level of play of college soccer as compared to high level club, uh, um, maybe second and third level pro? What's the difference between collegiate soccer and other types of soccer?
Yeah, well, so I think the traditional mindset that people would say is that, oh, well, college is a little bit more physical and direct and what have you versus playing or what have you. At America, in my experience, was a little different where maybe we would say that about some of our other opponents in the Patriot League, where we very much so ultimately we had a lot of like quote unquote center midfielders, that from high school that were playing at AU. And so we were all kind of prone to getting the ball on the ground and playing. Obviously moments to be direct, what have you. But obviously as we were playing, teams that were out of conference, they had the same mindset. So, we're, at a University of Maryland or at Klockner here in UVA, and we're going toe to toe with teams that are embracing that mindset. I think largely though it is very kind of situational in collegiate play where kind of depends on the coach, depends on their priorities, depends on whatever tactics for a given game. I think you've seen more start to trend in that direction of looking to get the ball on the ground, build out of the back, or pick moments to build out the back, and ultimately look to play some nice football. But that said, there's definitely scenarios, depending on who you're playing against, that it might need to turn into a more direct or physical game or what have you to compete and clear lines and not put yourself in vulnerable situations. So I think it certainly might vary a bit. Um, and maybe that even applies at the pro level too, right? Where you see scenarios where teams are like, you know what, like we know who we're playing today, and we're going to turn this into a physical game, and they're going to have to beat us in the air if they're going to want to beat us, kind of thing. But that said, plenty of teams that obviously are the end goal is to put the ball on the ground.
Yeah.
The only other piece I'll say though is that one piece that was like very important going into AU is it's a different mindset when you're going from a high school senior that maybe played high level club, soccer, into the college environment where, like for example, on our team, we had a couple guys that were maybe brought in the program on a little bit of the older side. And so, I was a 17, 18-year-old playing against a 21, 22-year-old from time to time. And so, certainly that like fitness level and getting in the gym, like building some, regardless of how physical the game is, like if you're going to compete as a 17, 18-year-old against a 21-year-old, like you got to get fitter, you got to get stronger, you got to get faster in general. So certainly a priority, maybe at both levels, right? Like you could say the same about pro, like, all right, well, we're not in college anymore, we're at the professional ranks, like you gotta like be able to match the fitness and what have you. But definitely a layer of emphasis as we were going into college to be able to match that initially so that you can then focus on whatever you're doing on the field.
Where do you see the trends going, Coach? You think more pro prospects will go to college and play, or do you think more will go to either MLS type academies or even overseas?
Well, I will say now the opportunities just exist for that route of being able to kind of go the MLS Academy route or MLS Next Academy route. In general, there's some kind of gray area in there, but that route now exists a little bit more where you can kind of go that pathway, get into a reserve team or a USL team that is connected to an MLS team, and or bypass it all if you're, that quality of a player to then just go directly to an MLS team. When I was playing, those kind of layers were, I don't want to say they didn't exist, but they were less common and not necessarily prioritized. And so the college path was really your only route if you wanted to find yourself at whatever that next level was for you. In terms of like trends now, like I think it's a lot more publicized that that route exists. So I think we'll obviously continue to see more and more of, you know, players going that route. Also, the international route, like I've seen a lot of, you know, some, you know, past friends and colleagues that have started to go international, not necessarily like to an EPL,
No,
but to a second,
Dutch
third
tier.
division, yeah, you know, fourth division, whatever it is. Very good players, you know, and maybe they did a year or two in college as well, but have prioritized that route. So all that to be said, I think there's now just more opportunities to potentially bypass the college route, but there's a ton of value in the college route. And I think that's maybe where like if I was in that spot today, I probably would still potentially choose the college route unless I felt like there was just a direct pathway to a professional level that was going to be very career oriented. But the college route, maybe this is good for full circle moment, bringing us back to the beginning here. The college route allows for you to build that kind of business administrative, you know, even social to an extent, but that business administrative mindset so that if in some case the soccer pathway doesn't work out for you, you can still lean on your experiences and your education to propel whatever your career is going to take you to. So value in both. You'll see a lot, I think, of both. And so maybe situational.
Yeah. Well, look, Coach, this has been great. I really enjoyed talking to you. I could talk soccer with you all day. Yeah, I'm really excited for your new family, and not so new anymore. But your opportunity with Stack. I'll leave the website information in the comments so people can find you. But yeah, this has been great. Let's keep in touch, and you got to swing by the dorms to pick up Chandler and you know, work him out a little bit. Make sure he's staying in shape.
No, I appreciate the invite, of course, as always. And yeah, I'll keep Chandler posted on some upcoming futsal or kind of ex-college men's leagues around here, and keep him in check.
That'd be great. Yeah. Well, Coach, thanks again. And let's keep in touch.
Awesome, Julian. Appreciate it. You have a good one.
It was great. Okay, buddy. Take care.
Bye.